Thank you for joining us for the America's First Ladies Luncheon to honor the First Lady we claim as our own here in Grand Rapids, Betty Ford. My name is Rachel Siglo, and I am the Deputy Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. This luncheon in Betty Ford's honor has rightly earned the reputation as one of the best events in West Michigan. That reputation is because of your love and enthusiasm for Betty Ford and your desire to learn more about the lives of first families in the White House. Thank you to Meijer, Amway, Fifth Third Bank, Spectrum Health, Blue Cross Blue Shield Blue Care Network of Michigan, Green with Envy, and our other sponsors for their generous support of our program. To all of our guests, thank you for your continued interest and support of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. At this point, we've learned how to successfully join together virtually and in common purpose, if not in person. This past year has been unlike any in recent history, and we appreciate the effort you've taken to still take part in the First Ladies Luncheon, which wouldn't be the same without each of you. Today, we take you away from the concerns of the moment and offer a program filled with nature and all its beauty. Our panelists will discuss the history of landscape architecture, the flower and vegetable gardens at the White House, and a garden bestowing Mrs. Ford's name in Vail, Colorado. I hope you will pick up on our theme. Yes, many of us have been isolated, but we are turning a corner, and we want to focus on the beauty that surrounds us, nature. Today's moderator is Ann Compton. Ann was the White House correspondent for ABC News, covering 7 presidents and their administrations. Her tenure at the White House began during the Ford administration, and we are pleased to have her with us today. We will first hear from Jonathan Pliska, White House historian and author of A Garden for the President, A History of the White House Grounds. Sit back and enjoy our historical perspective of gardening at the White House and Mrs. Ford's love of flowers.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. You know, today many people call Washington a swamp, but the site was picked. Well, it really was a swamp. It certainly was not the Garden of Eden. Jonathan, what is it about that site that would shock people today if they were to visit the area around the White House as it existed back in the 1700s?
Well, that's a really good point. The political anecdote, of course, about the swamp is a kind of a modern day thing. Everybody hears that in the news. But back when the White House, the groundbreaking began in 1790, and the White House itself is situated on top of a hill. And just like Capitol Hill, there's literally a physical hill underneath the White House. The White House looks down in historical times on swampy marshlands that actually, literally, people believed at that period of time had an unhealthy air about it. To make matters worse, the construction of the White House more or less obliterated the landscape as it pre-existed. So I like to call it the 3 Bs: barren, bleak, and brown, when John Adams moved in 1800. Right. And the period accounts go on to state visitors from that time described it as I believe the quote was a barren, stony, unfenced waste. Another visitor described it as a disgrace to the young republic. It was not a great-looking place simply because it was a construction site for so many years. But
the world was used to the European standard of fabulous palaces and manicured English gardens, and Europe, which had been around for centuries, building up its public places. It sounds to me like the early White House was kind of what George Washington would have wanted, something simple, an executive mansion, not a palace.
That's absolutely correct. And that's a good point, especially because George Washington situated the front door of the White House exactly where it stands today. He was the only president not to have lived in the White House, but every president, including George Washington, has walked upon the White House grounds.
Tell me a little bit about what you know, because you are an historian. You're not here as a gardener. You're here as to tell us the life story of the area. Was there a real commitment early on, or did it take decades before the grounds and the setting of the White House really took on importance and got money to do something about it?
So Abigail Adams, the first lady to live in the White House, and we should be talking about the first ladies especially today, she described the scene to her daughter in the year 1800 in a letter to her daughter, and she described the scene as a place without the least fence, yard, or other convenience, but she optimistically noted that it's a beautiful spot capable of every improvement. And then the successor, President Thomas Jefferson, moved in 1800 as well, and in 1801, and he immediately really got to work improving the grounds. So he actually, in part, developed the first landscape plan for the White House and then spent the next 8 years of his presidency developing the grounds.
And of course, he had Monticello that he was also developing. So he was somebody with kind of European training in terms of the art and the architecture. And those physical settings were very, very important to him. Throughout the rest of the 1800s, leading up to the Civil War, because at that point, downtown Washington was still, a work in progress. The Washington Monument was only half built, and the Capitol Dome wasn't finished, as I recall. Were there other first ladies who notably made an effort to bring the White House and its physical surroundings up to date?
Sure. Perhaps the best example is Mary Todd Lincoln. From that time period. At that point in time, the White House had a vegetable garden, a kitchen garden in today's parlance. It was approximately 1 acre in size. It was located on the south grounds, and the Lincolns grew, the gardeners at the White House grew most of the produce that was consumed by the Lincolns, and Mary Todd Lincoln had a special interest in the flowers, but also the kitchen garden. The period accounts state that she delivered strawberries directly from the White House kitchen garden to convalescing Union soldiers in Washington, D.C. hospitals.
Really? Really? And of course, the kitchen garden is something that was kind of brought back in the 2010s. But were there other times? I mean, I assume they had a garden to help feed the family, if not convalescents, through most of the late 1800s and into the 1900s.
Yeah, so the first fruits and vegetables were probably planted on the White House grounds during James Madison's tenure. So from about 1809, maybe on into about just, prior to the burning of the White House during the War of 1812. But really, this took off under the tenure of John Quincy Adams and then also Andrew Jackson. That's when that kitchen garden I was describing really got going. And what's I find very interesting, I hope hopefully other people will as well, I was able to track down the receipts for fruit and vegetable seeds purchased during the Lincoln administration.
And can people eat today what American presidents and first ladies ate?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's good to have a list like that from any American president. It's great if you can have it from Abraham Lincoln. And you can today still purchase all manner of fruits and vegetable seeds: cucumbers, beets, turnips, lettuce, cabbage, beets, the like. And you can purchase those online through specialized seed growers, and I believe as a treat to those attending the event in person and picking up their boxed lunches, there's going to be a seed packet of the type of seeds that would have been grown at the White House during the 19th century.
That's a wonderful legacy. It really is. In our backyard, I live in Washington, D.C., same house for 40 years, and my husband's always had a big vegetable garden. It was only during the pandemic that I started an actual flower garden. Maybe I should see whether the past presidents grew iris and peonies. As I'm hoping this year mine will come up for the first time.
Well, I can tell you for a fact that the First Lady Edith Roosevelt, the wife of Theodore Roosevelt, had you said irises and peonies,
Iris
I believe?
and peonies.
Yeah, she definitely had those growing in what was the progenitor of the current rose garden. It was a colonial-style garden during her time period at the White House.
I want to get to the rose garden, but first, well, I'll start with this. The rose garden, I have been in and out of 1,000 times.
Lucky you.
Lucky me, over the course of the arc of 40 years and 7 presidents, beginning with President Gerald Ford. And the rose garden was always a formal office space. It was an official event space. It wasn't just for the dogs. Every once in a while, you could tell the president's dogs had been there, but it was a beautiful setting, outdoor setting that was used constantly, even in somewhat cold, even somewhat rainy weather. Jacqueline Kennedy redid the Rose Garden. Was that a dramatic departure point from generations before, or was it a process of evolution?
It was definitely a process of evolution and kind of a dramatic point of departure. So I guess the answer to your question is both. Really the history of that site as a garden space begins in 1903 with First Lady Roosevelt. She developed a garden there, and both also on the east side where the current Jacqueline Kennedy Garden is located. What were known then and now as colonial-style gardens. Boxwood hedges, gravel walks, parterres of garden flowers, old-fashioned favorites. In addition to peonies, there was phlox and asters, and roses too. But it was sort of typical of the kind of thing you'd see at maybe Mount Vernon. And that lasted for about a decade until her successor, Ellen Wilson, completely redid her spaces in a more modern taste. Ellen Wilson was also a painter, and she had a more, what I would call, modern aesthetic. So during her, the modern rose garden first kind of started to take shape. The rectangular shape with the open central lawn really dates back to that time period. Then, fast forward a little bit more, by the 1930s, the basic plan was still in place, but I hate to say it, but garden was a little bit overgrown and not particularly well kept. I think any gardener can commiserate with that. And then during the Truman renovation of the White House between 1948 and 1952, and pretty much the entirety of the South grounds was enveloped as one big construction site. When the White House itself was torn down to the bare walls and the studs. You see the famous photos of a bulldozer inside the White House. All the staging for that pretty well obliterated the previous iterations of the garden, and then bring in Jackie Kennedy and JFK in 1962 with the modern rose garden.
Yeah, and that's where Mrs. Kennedy called in Bunny Mellon, and they did very, very extensive, lovely recreation. You know, the White House grounds and the Rose Garden are really kind of formal places. I think very few people in the public get to visit it personally. It is not a suburban backyard. But you describe in your book and in your chats that it more relaxed functions. It is a private place for families, but it's almost kind of, I think you called it supernatural.
Yeah, and I think most people in the United States or anywhere around the world sort of view the White House as this sort of supernatural place. And to be fair, it kind of is, but it's also at its core a home and a home office. And for those of us still going through the pandemic, that probably sounds pretty familiar. But so it's instead of just being my home office or your home office, it's the home office of the President of the United States. The White House, though, is also known as the People's House. And so that really means the White House grounds are the people's grounds. And if you start to think about it that way, it isn't so far removed from a typical suburban home. Typically, suburban homes, mine included, have a more formal or dressy front lawn. That would be the north grounds of the White House with the north portico facing Pennsylvania Avenue, and a more private, less formal backyard. That's the larger south grounds looking down toward the Washington Monument. And that's pretty much what happens at the White House today.
Let's get to the issue of just how sacrosanct are the White House grounds. Are they untouchable? And you're an historian, I'm a journalist, neither one of us is a politician, but first ladies, especially in the modern era, if they want to go around changing things, there's resistance to that.
There is. I think it's fair to say that people have had an opinion about Melania Trump's recent Rose Garden renovation. But hopefully, as the history of that site, which I just briefly enumerated, describes, the Rose Garden itself is a fairly, in the grand history of the White House grounds, which go on for more than 2 centuries, 1962 is not that long ago, really. And previous to that time, there were a lot of different iterations of that garden. So the idea that anything is on the grounds is sacrosanct isn't really true. The president and the first lady, they're temporary residents, but when they're there, they're in charge. But the good news is that every president and every first lady has had the good sense to tread lightly, no pun intended, on the grounds and respect the history and add to it rather than subtract from it. And this definitely includes First Lady Trump's recent renovation. Rachel Lambert Mellon, Bunny Mellon, specifically, even in 1989, she returned to the White House to spruce up the Rose Garden under the Reagan administration. And at that time, even Mrs. Mellon, the original creator of the Rose Garden, was actually advocating for the removal of all or some of those crabapple trees, which was sort of the crux of the criticism that Mrs. Trump received. And this was because, well, the roses and the other plants underneath it needed more light. I mean, it's kind of, the bigger a tree gets as it grows, the more it's going to shade things out. And so Mrs. Mellon was even in favor of removing some of them. And those trees that were removed just last year were actually the second or third iterations of the crabapples. They were not the historic trees.
Yeah. Well, I must confess, I don't take sides on politics, but I miss the trees, especially when I was doing a new stand-up in the Rose Garden, and you had the beautiful blossoms behind you, or those beautiful magnolias in the corner. But the trees all around. It also gave the Rose Garden a bit of seclusion. It gave it a definition. So you as an historian have a phrase that I don't really know how to translate into average. What does the phrase to professional historians mean? A period of significance. Isn't the last 230 years a period of significance for the White House?
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. At the risk of maybe summarizing this a little bit too much for some of my fellow historians, a period of significance is basically a fancy way of saying when the historic thing happened. For a lot of historic places in the United States, think Gettysburg National Battlefield Park. Well, the place there is more or less significant because of the two-day battle fought in 1863 during the American Civil War. So it's pretty easy to wrap your head around a period of significance in a place like that. But with the White House, it's different. With the White House grounds, it's different. The entire 200 plus odd years of the White House grounds is the period of significance. And there's very few places in the nation that you can say that about. Even more significant to me is that the period of significance is open-ended. By simply because it is the White House, whatever happens tomorrow or next week or next month or next year is going to be historically significant.
Can I tell you one little story that
Please.
affected me? And this has to do with the beautiful Jackson Magnolias, which are how old now?
Oh, well, if you believe the story associated with them, they were planted by Andrew Jackson sometime around 1828.
So they are gigantic, and what we see close up is there are huge metal poles going up the entire lake, and they are wired together because the President's Marine One helicopter comes out, the downdraft beats against them. But one morning, I got a call from the ABC News desk at about 1:10 in the morning, and they said a plane has crashed into the White House. Get there quick. Well, I got there. It turned out it was a little tiny ultralight plane, and it had a kook had tried to land at 1 o'clock in the morning on the south lawn of the White House, but there were bleachers set up for a police event the next day. So he pulled up, hit the ground, gouged the ground, and went straight up through the Jackson and smashed in, broke the windows in the White House medical office right underneath the president's bedroom. That kind of moment, it damaged the tree a little bit, it damaged the window, but my goodness, it scared all of us.
Absolutely, and my hat's off to you because I write about things after they've happened. You're there covering it live, and I can only imagine what that was like. It was during the Clinton administration, correct? And I believe thankfully the president and first lady weren't home at the time.
Which is why I wasn't at the White House at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Real quickly, the Jackson Magnolias, there are lots of trees on the White House grounds that presidents have planted for very significant historic reasons. Do you have any favorites?
Yeah, I wish the Gerald and President Gerald Ford and First Lady Betty Ford planted a American elm to mark the bicentennial of the United States. Unfortunately, that tree no longer survives, but it was a very important moment and a great way to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the nation.
Was it Dutch elm disease? Was this the era where we were losing so many elms?
I believe so, yes, unfortunately. And the good news is that there are some genetically resistant hybrids available now, one of which was originally discovered literally on the National Mall. So those are beginning to be planted at the White House now.
And Laura Bush, when they redesigned Pennsylvania Avenue, asked that there be American elms, perhaps these hybrids, planted all up and down literally at the address of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And some people said that was bringing about kind of the restoration of elms which had died off and oaks had become so predominant. But the historic nature or the historic importance of presidents planting trees, that's a real legacy for the White House.
Absolutely. For many years, the oldest tree with a known presidential association was an American elm planted by John Quincy Adams in about 1826.
Front or back lawn?
The south lawn, it was actually on one of the large mounds on the south lawn. You probably remember it. It's an enormous tree, and a section of it is actually on display at the White House Visitor Center. So that was the oldest tree with a presidential association, and you can see how far back that goes. But currently, there are 33 plantings that were either planted by a president or a first lady. The Jackson Magnolias are the oldest, but some of their history is a little bit in doubt because they, in fact, don't show up in early photographs of the White House. So it's a beautiful story that they're associated with Jackson, but it might not be entirely historically accurate. The oldest tree with a known association with presidential administration is actually a beautiful Japanese maple on the south grounds near the south fountain. It's one of the smaller trees on the grounds, but for for my money, it punches above its weight class. It's beautiful, particularly because it's red in the fall, and it really stands out. And that was planted in 1893 by First Lady Frances Folsom Cleveland.
So many of the plantings around the White House are there for security. When a hotel just a block from the White House reopened after years of being closed, the Secret Service actually went up to their rooftop restaurant, checking on the sight line so that the president wouldn't be exposed in public. I guess that's the kind of thing we have to worry about, at least in the 20th, 21st century.
It is, and sort of touching upon the role of security and the need in the modern world we live in. One of the more recent plantings, it was a flowering dogwood planted by President Bill and First Lady Hillary Clinton in honor and in remembrance of the victims of the Oklahoma City federal bombing.
Yeah. Gerald and Betty Ford put in a swimming pool. You can't see it from the street. I can't see it from West Executive Avenue, which is a street that's now just a parking lot. But they did that because he had been vice president for about a nanosecond, and his friends had raised money for a pool at the vice president's residence. He became president. Do some people consider that an eyesore, or is that kind of a charming addition, and certainly something that American first families have enjoyed since the Ford era?
Well, I don't think I know anybody that considers it an eyesore, and that's really because of what you just said. Nobody can really see it until you're right up on it. And for that matter, the same goes for the White House tennis court and a number of other spots on the White House grounds. They've been very carefully installed over the years so as to not impinge upon the historic character of the grounds, damage any of the significant tree plantings, and really to not interfere with views to and from the White House, the iconic shots of the exterior of the building. So no, I don't think anybody would consider it an eyesore.
Do you know what First Lady used the pool more than anybody else?
I believe it was Barbara Bush.
It was Barbara Bush, who loved to swim, and I think she had to be very careful to make sure when she wore her white terry cloth bathrobe down the colonnade past the Oval Office, she got by without anybody seeing her. I remember old pictures of the White House showing they had a greenhouse or a conservatory.
Yeah, so the greenhouses and the conservatory are both 19th century aspects of the White House and of the White House grounds. The conservatory was a private space, rather, for the President and First Lady, their invited guests, and it was this beautiful, kind of exotic place. It was located on top of the West Terrace, or the West Colonnade, and it was accessed through what was, at one time, President Grant's billiard room. And the greenhouses were just exactly what it sounds like, a series of working buildings that produced camellias, ferns, orchids. There were actually 2 rose houses at its peak. And so, again, with 2 rose houses shows you where the priority has always been for presidential flowers. And these were not small enterprises. They covered significant acreage, and they were located where the modern-day West Wing is. In fact, they were removed in 1902 when Theodore Roosevelt built the original West Wing.
He ran out of family space inside the White House, so he built the West Wing so he would have offices that didn't have 6 kids underfoot.
Well, and again, I think those of us working from home today can really relate to that.
Pandemic taught us all a lesson on that, didn't it? I would love to wind up on something that touches on that. I know it doesn't technically have to do with the gardens and the growth and the design, but every family I covered at the White House had pets. I was not there for the Kennedy ponies or the historic, goats and sheep and whatever. I was there for Gerald Ford's dog, Liberty, who I think got one of the first splashes into the Gerald Ford pool.
And Liberty's puppies, of course.
But dogs and some cats and I think some of the kids had a gerbil or two. But that also shows how the White House, although it's a tribute to the glory of the United States, it's a centerpiece of our civic society, it's also a home. Do you have any favorite pets back in the archives of presidential history?
Oh, absolutely. So, putting aside the dogs and the cats for the purposes of this, I would. I should confess before I say anything else. I'm originally from the state of Wisconsin, and I'm a little biased because of that. But my personal favorite presidential pet of all time was a dairy cow named Pauline Wayne, also possibly the greatest pet name in all of presidential history. That was also the proud pet of President Taft. And Pauline Wayne grazed on the White House grounds as well as the grounds of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. And she was something of a local celebrity. She was interviewed by members of the press. She never really said much, but it was a good time. Everybody liked her very much. And she was a gift from a Wisconsin senator who had heard that President Taft, who it's fair to say was probably the largest president. He was not a small man. 300
pounds or so, as legend has it.
Yeah, and he apparently was having trouble getting enough fresh milk, and being a good representative of the dairy state, he sent the president Pauline Wayne, and the president loved her very much. He did not generally let Pauline travel because she needed to provide milk, and she was also a pet. But one of the few times she did travel, she traveled by her own personal railroad car. So she really traveled in first class. The problem with this is she was going to the Wisconsin State Fair. It was a bit of a favor from the president. And somewhere along the lines, her train car was detached and was on its way to the Chicago stockyards on a different train, and it was just caught just in the nick of time. Otherwise, that story would have not had a very happy ending. Oh. But she came back to the White House, safe and sound, and then when the President Taft's administration ended, she went back to the senator's farm in Wisconsin.
So Pauline got retirement after 4 years, just like presidents do.
Absolutely.
Well, the mystique and the grace of the White House never goes into retirement. And Jonathan, thank you so much, Jonathan Pliska, for sharing the history and the depth and the information. And I think a lot of us had no idea behind the legacy of the White House. And thank you so much. Now, just for the next few minutes, a bit of time travel. Going back to the Fords' hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan, we want you to hear someone who knows some of the Ford family's earliest stories. Please welcome Michigan florist Bing Goee.
The Ford family enjoyed giving flowers. It is not unexpected that she would have a love for flowers. Look at her last name, Bloomer, right. Maiden name, right? Exactly. So, she always enjoyed flowers. The direct relationship with President and Mrs. Ford really was not part of my story, but my relationship is really an ongoing relationship with the children as we provide the floral tributes for President Ford at his birthday, for Mrs. Ford at her birthday and other special occasions. The children and then also those who are involved with the Ford family are just plain and simply wonderful human beings. They're kind, they're compassionate, they care about their constituents, and it shows how they also enjoy using flowers to express their appreciation for their constituents here in West Michigan. President Ford loves to send Mrs. Ford flowers. When it is just everyday flowers, there's not always the same thing. But when there are special occasions, President Ford knew that one of Betty Ford's favorite flowers is the yellow roses. So that always would be part of the gift that he would provide or send to Mrs. Betty Ford. Also, when there were times in which there was a special occasion in which Mrs. Ford would want a corsage, her favorite corsage flower was the white Cattleya orchid with a yellow throat. One of the floral arrangement that is a standing order, President and Mrs. Ford would send a sympathy flowers for someone that they knew here in West Michigan that they wanted to send a floral tribute. And this is the standing order that you can see here that they would always want to send. President Ford would always want to have red, white, and blue flowers. And so their favorite flowers to be used is the white gladiolas, the red carnations, and the blue iris. Every time a sympathy floral arrangement was being sent by President Ford and Mrs. Ford, it had to be these flowers and this design. And then their biggest thing is they always wanted to have big red ribbons in the center of it. We have also received different letters from Mrs. Ford. This one is a letter that was sent to Mr. Frank DeVos. This was a letter that was sent to me personally by Mrs. Ford. Mrs. Ford, after they left the White House, there is a company called Hauserman Orchids in Villa Park, Illinois. When they found out that Mrs. Ford was going to be a keynote speaker at one of the Allied Floral Conventions in Colorado in 1982, I believe it was, the Hauserman Orchid organization wanted to also bring out an orchid that would be named after Mrs. Ford. And at that time, they had this orchid that is an orchid that was unnamed, but that they had produced. And they asked if Mrs. Ford would allow them to name that orchid. And this is the result of that effort. In the words of the grower, L.C. Betty Ford orchid was by far the most complex of any First Lady hybrid today. It had an exceptionally long lineage comprising 7 generations of breeding and 12 different species. And I think, to be honest with you, I think that truly reflects Mrs. Ford. Kind, compassionate, and when she walks in the room, she makes a statement, and I think this orchid certainly reflects that personality and that character of Betty Ford. You know, Mrs. Ford has been such a role model for many of us, a role model for the women and the young ladies of this community and in this nation, really. And we're so excited and honored to have been able to continue that tradition and to provide the flowers for the Ford family. And as we may remember, President Ford died December 26 or 27, and flowers were hard to get, you know, and to receive, and we had to fly in a lot of the flowers for the funeral work. But we heard about this orchid, right? And so we worked very hard with the Hauserman people. The problem was this orchid only blooms certain times of the year. And so they worked very hard to find a way to force the blooming of the orchid. And so we were able to get one orchid. We showed it to Mrs. Ford, and we asked her people, hey, if she was willing to receive this, please give this to her. And I think she did. And we were so excited to be able to share that with her. It's been truly an honor for us. And again, Susan Ford has been very kind to us and appreciative of the work that we've been doing on their behalf. But flowers have played a major role in their lives. They would always send flowers, right, for sympathy or for any other occasions, for their friends, for family members, and things like that. Yeah, yeah, so you bet. Thank you so much.
Betty Ford's legacy did not end when she left the White House. Vail, Colorado was a favorite family gathering place for all of the Fords. And Nicola Ripley is going to join us from Vail, Colorado, the curator, the executive director of Betty Ford's final garden gift to America, the Betty Ford Alpine Garden. Nicola, welcome, and tell me, where is it you're standing or sitting, and what are we seeing here?
So I'm sitting in the Alpine House at Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. The Alpine House is right next to the Education Center, which is at the heart of the gardens. And this is a cold greenhouse where we have alpine plants in bloom. The gardens themselves right now is still under snow, and so we chose the Alpine House here so we could bring some color to the presentation.
Wonderful. Tell me, first of all, how did all this start?
So it started when Vail was in its very early days. So we're talking sort of 1986. The ski mountain had been open for a few years, but the town was really starting to grow. And local gardeners got together and said, we need to show people who are coming to live at 8,200 feet what kind of plants will grow here. So they decided to start a public display garden. And the piece of land that the town of Vail gave to them was right next to the Gerald Ford Amphitheater. And the town was delighted with the garden that was put in place, and invited the group that had started what was called then the Vail Alpine Garden to grow bigger and bigger, and to develop the gardens around the amphitheater. And it was at that point that the group decided to contact Mrs. Ford and say, you know, that they would be delighted if she would be willing to give her name to the gardens. And she loved the idea. That was in 1988, and she came and helped to open the gardens and got very involved, and you know, was involved right until till she died. So we were thrilled.
She had so many friends in the area. I have been to Vail with the Fords. It was, you know, my first month on the job covering the White House for ABC News. I packed my bags and I got to ski with the president, wave at the First Lady, and got to know so many people in the village who were good friends of theirs. And that special connection to a president, even one who didn't live there year round, and even after, of course, he left office in 1977, it's quite a tribute to have her hand in putting this together. Are most of the gardens outside? I know you're on the inside, but just give us an idea of the expanse of what you have there.
Yeah, it's about 5 acres of garden outside, and it's you know, very intensely cultivated. As you can see in here, most of the plants are very small. So we do specialize in mountain plants, and particularly alpine plants, and those are plants that grow above tree line in nature. So it's a series of winding pathways, water features, bridges. It's a very beautiful place. Right now it's under snow, and that's one of those interesting things. People say, you know, how can you grow so many beautiful plants with so much snow? But it's because of the snow that blankets and keeps the plants protected, that enables us to grow as many things as we can here.
So most of us with backyard gardens aren't going to have both the insulating effect during harsh winters, especially if we're living as far north as Michigan or Illinois, where I grew up. But we also don't necessarily have the water supply. Is that a key factor, especially for the outdoor plantings?
We certainly have irrigation here, but most of the plants that we grow in these gardens are either alpine plants which are adapted already to harsh winds, low water, or they're native plants and native to Colorado. And Colorado naturally is an arid state, and so native plants don't require a lot of additional water.
Talk a little bit about the plants inside the atrium where you are, the alpine house where you're sitting. These are ones that you care for during the winter months, but they get plenty of sun, except for the obviously the shortened hours of sunlight in the day. What do you have to do for the plants inside? And second question is, are most of these native to Colorado or native to the United States? Are there alpine imports from the Alps?
Well, the first part of that question about, well, certainly most of the plants in here are for different parts of the world. And the ones we grow in here are the ones that require a little extra care and attention. So we have particularly plants called Dionysias, which come from the mountains of Iraq and Iran, and they are very temperamental. They grow in alpine conditions, but they don't like overhead water. So we have them here in very specialized conditions. So these are mostly alpine plants, but from all over the world. The rock that they're growing in is a tufa rock, which is like a porous limestone. It's deposited in warm springs, and it's a real favorite for growing alpine plants because the plants grow directly into the rocks. The rocks help drain water away from the roots so that it provides perfect conditions for alpine plants.
That's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about, of course, the rock element of so many of these plants are used to that kind of environment. Do these rocks particularly, have they all come from Colorado, or are those the kind of things that you can import as well?
Well, tufa rock is quite hard to find because it's such a specialized rock. This rock came from some private land in South Dakota, so not too far away. The other thing to remember about this alpine house is that unlike many botanical gardens that have conservatories, we spend all our time trying to keep cool. We want the plants to go dormant in the winter time, so even when the conditions are very, very cold outside, we'll have the windows open, and we encourage the plants to take the sleep that they need over winter time. And then when the days get longer and they get more sunlight, then they bounce back into bloom. And that's what you're seeing right now.
That's wonderful. What about bugs, pests?
The fortunate thing is we have very few bugs and pests up here. You know, as the climate is changing a little bit, things are creeping closer. But the conditions here are, generally speaking, very harsh. And so a lot of the things that are problematic in other parts of the country don't cause problems for us here.
Do you have, I've been to Vail in all seasons with the Fords. As I recall, there are many foreign visitors, and they must take a remarkable look at the kind of alpine setting as well. Many of them, they may be skiers or visitors in the summer, but how remarkable this particular collection of plants is for people from all corners of the world.
We certainly bore that in mind when we were trying to decide what kinds of plants to grow here. You know, many gardens only grow plants from the region that they are in the country, and we made a decision that we were a very international ski destination, and that, like you say, many of our visitors come from all over the world. And so we made a decision. We certainly, the pride of our collection is our Colorado Alpine collection, but we have plants from all over the world, and the most asked for plants are the Edelweiss from the European Alps, and the deep blue gentian also from the Alps. And we also grow a Himalayan blue poppy, which is not a very easy plant to grow. And those are the highlights of this garden. I suppose columbines too, of course, from Colorado, but no, the international plants cause a stir.
I imagine it's a learning curve, especially when you're bringing in plants from the Himalayas or the European heights. What have you learned about these plants by putting them in this kind of controlled environment? That they are hardier or more delicate than you expected? Have you been surprised by anything that these plants have taught you?
I mean, I would say that they're unbelievably hardy. And one of the best things about Vail, Colorado, is that we are able to put these mostly out in natural conditions. We plant them in native soil for the most part, which is very hard and would not grow your common garden plants. But it's what the alpine plants need. They thrive on a very lean, rocky soil. So the harder, the better, really, for most of those alpine plants. In England, where I'm from, we have to spend a lot of time protecting alpines because they get too much rain. So they're grown in little cloches with lids on them to prevent the rain coming down on the plants. But here we can just put them out there and they thrive in the environment here. So we have to do very little fertilizing, very little watering. So they make life easy for us, really, in many ways.
So many gardeners would love to have a garden that makes their life easy. Well, Nicola, you get to see so many of the guests and the tourists who come through Vail. Did you get to host the Fords at the Alpine Garden?
Yes, many times. In fact, they used to come unannounced most of the time, and come at times when we weren't expecting them. And so that was a real treat. I remember one particular afternoon, the gardens was very quiet, and I had my daughter in her stroller. She was just a little baby, and she was parked by one of the benches in the shade, and I heard a voice calling over to me, did I mind if they moved the stroller because they wanted to sit at the bench? And I looked over, and it was President and Mrs. Ford. So of course, I rushed over and said, of course, no problem. But by that time, Mrs. Ford was already, playing with Katie in her little baby stroller. And she said, if you have some errands to run, don't mind us. We'll watch the baby for you while you do your chores. And so, that was, I laugh and tell my daughter that her first babysitter was a president. So
that's a wonderful and very warm and very typical of the Fords, warm story about how their graciousness with everyone. Nicola, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
For anyone who loves flowers, could there be a more perfect, more dreamy setting for them than the White House itself? Betty Ford moved in, and with her, her daughter, Susan Ford Bales, who joins us now. Susan, welcome from your home in Texas. I've covered Susan as a reporter since she was 16 years old. Susan, those times when you moved into the White House, flowers were everywhere.
My mother, loved flowers, and so she was happy to have fresh flowers in her house, and I like to have fresh flowers in my house here.
Absolutely. At the White House, there is an elaborate hierarchy. There is a full-time florist on the staff, and I have seen the cart going around in the White House putting fresh flowers on almost every table on a daily basis. Did your mom get involved with that? Was there a greenhouse on the property where she could come in and choose things?
No, there wasn't a greenhouse on the property, and if there is a greenhouse someplace else, I never got to see it. But she loved the fresh flowers, and yes, the White House did beautiful fresh flowers. You know, you got to remember, Anne, when we moved in, it was a pretty tumultuous time, so I don't think Mother got involved in the flowers as quickly as she would have. That probably would have been something she would have chosen to do, but she had so many other things. As you know, she had a state dinner within 6 days of us moving in there. So she had a lot of other things keeping her busy, but she loved the floral shop. And she would pick the colors and that sort of thing. And she has favorite flowers. There's no question.
Well, we're going to get to the favorite flowers, but I want to ask you about the idea that the White House is a world stage for American design, and your mother could use those state dinners for flowers and statuary. Do you remember that first state dinner? I don't think I was at that one. I was at the one for the Shah of Iran.
Right. I don't think I went to the first one either, because I think actually we were still living in Alexandria, Virginia. We hadn't moved in. But the one that stands out to me the most was the one that was done for President Sadat. And he was a big fan of Western art. And so Mother had Remingtons and other Western sculptures as the centerpieces. Some tables just had flowers and some had sculptures. But she did that with other heads of state. She found out what they were interested in and what kind of art they were interested in. And then from there, they would choose sculptures to be in the centerpieces and how to do the flowers. And I mean, the social office did an amazing job of coordinating tablecloths with sculptures, with flowers and that sort of thing. And the china and choosing which china. My mother, I know, made the difference, and they went away from long head tables to round tables because she felt they were much easier for people to have conversations.
Susan, you are so right about that. And in this White House state dining room, there's room with round tables for about 130 guests. And those were the years when I first started covering the White House. And I think that was a larger seating than some of the earlier state dinners. And the idea that all of the flowers and the other decor come together. To go back to the Sadat dinner, remember, not only was it a tumultuous time for the United States and for your parents and the change in administration in Washington, but it was on the cusp of movement in the Middle East. Eventually, another year or two later, came the Camp David Accords. And President Sadat was a very, very important player in this. Egypt moving was going to be extraordinary. And he was such a worldly man, and he did appreciate American culture and the idea that these famous Remington bronzes could be put on a White House dinner table surrounded by beautiful flowers was really a classic departure, one that actually most First Ladies never followed through either. I remember one state dinner, I believe it was for an Austrian president or premier, and there was a crystal sculpture in the middle. And I know that the staff does a lot, but your mother really brought the style and the taste and, frankly, a level of elegance that was classically hers.
Yeah, it really was, Anne. It was, I think her dance background played so much into her life and being so artistic in that sense. And she was great with clothes because, before she married my dad, she was a model and she was a fashion person. And so putting things together like this was natural to her. Somehow I didn't get all of that, but She was very good at it, and I admired her taste.
Well, I covered her in the serious stuff too, including when you and I were climbing the Great Wall of China together while your mom and dad were waiting for Chairman Mao to call so they could go over in Beijing for that classic major visit. But your mom did always bring a sense of elegance, but in the family quarters, she eventually was able to make that comfortable for you and you were living at home, your brothers were not, was that right?
Yes, I was the only one living at home full time right then. So, but yeah, we brought some of our furnishings from Alexandria for their den so that they had their chairs and that sort of thing, and they brought their bed from Alexandria because they liked that bed. So, you know, you can make that house your own, shall we say.
Susan, I want to ask you about something that I did not know existed until 2 months ago. The last 15 First Ladies have had orchids designed and named in their honor. I did not know this. And I've got to tell you, if you have never seen it, the Betty Ford orchid is extraordinary. Bing Goey, earlier in this program, showed it and explained how it took 7 generations of breeding to get exactly the style. And I understand from the grower who does this that he's even gave one to Jill Biden while she was still vice president's wife, and that is now her first lady. It's a beautiful yellow one. But your mother's, your mother's orchid is absolutely the fanciest and the most beautiful of them all. But her favorite flowers?
Well, her favorite flower is a rose, and she loved pinks and pastels and corals and pale yellows. When we designed the cover for her casket, the floral covering, if you go back and look at those pictures, they were all done in roses of those shades, and she picked them all out. I mean, she picked out those colors herself. It wasn't done after she was gone. So she was a pastel girl. She liked pastels.
Well, and it's how nice that she could make her own wishes known even after she relinquished the reins of power. But there's a special flower in her honor as well, a lily?
It's called the Betty Ford lily. It's kind of it's a red-orange. It's very vibrant. I have several growing in my yard here in Texas. Every time I move, I dig them up from my yard and I take them with me because other people don't appreciate them the way I do. And I'm lucky enough that mine usually blooms about Mother's Day. And I have put them in my daughter's yards and shared them with friends and that sort of thing. And I love my Betty Ford daylily.
Well, I think part of your mother's legacy, and one of the reasons this program today is so appealing, is that her influence and her taste is shared by so many people who also love the sense, even if, like me, black thumb, can't grow anything, to be able to appreciate and bring those essences into our own homes and our own entertaining. And we just had a look at the Alpine garden that bears her name and the wonderful natural native-born plants that grow in beautiful Vail, Colorado, where you and your family spent so many wonderful seasons, winter, warm and cold. Betty Ford's legacy is one that kind of all of us can appreciate, I think.
Oh, I think that's true. And my mother taught me the love of gardening when I was a young child. The boys had the job of mowing lawns with my dad, and I got the job of learning to weed flower beds and cut back her roses and do those things. So I'm sure that's where I learned the love of gardening. And you know, flowers don't really talk back. They just show you beautiful things, and that's what I love about them.
What a great point. Flowers, like if you need a friend in Washington, get a bed of flowers.
Yes, exactly.
Susan, nothing beats royalty, and your parents welcomed Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip to the White House at the time of the American bicentennial, putting to the side all that unpleasantness about burning the White House in 1812. But that state dinner must have been a remarkable occasion.
It was a beautiful evening. I don't know if you were covering the White House then, Anne, but they had put a tent on the South Lawn, and which is the only time we did it during our administration, and it was a white tie dinner. It was the first time I got to wear long white gloves because I wore a one-shoulder dress, which was probably one of my most favorite dresses ever, and don't know if I had a date. At least it doesn't stand out. But it was a beautiful, beautiful evening. But one of the funny stories from that evening was the fact that the band, when they played the first song for the first dance, I think it was the Marine Band.
Marine Band.
Okay. They played The Lady is a Tramp. And so my dad was dancing with Queen Elizabeth, and they played The Lady is a Tramp. And I don't know if anybody else noticed it, but my mother did, of course, and she was highly embarrassed. And I'm sure the news media covered it and, criticized for whatever, but that was a lovely, lovely evening. And there is a picture of Mother dancing with Prince Philip that is, the energy between the two of them was just wonderful.
And he's sadly missed now. How nice to have that memory at this point. And yes, you're right. Anytime royalty arrives at the White House, it's always white tie.
Yes, absolutely.
Susan, thank you for being here and representing your mother and your family with this wonderful audience that is here to celebrate Betty Ford's great mastery and her great influence on all of us. Susan Ford Bales, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. And now we'll hand it back to Gleaves Whitney, the executive director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation.
Wow, what a fine gathering of people to help us celebrate the birthday and remarkable life of First Lady Betty Bloomer Ford. I'm Gleaves Whitney, Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and on behalf of the Foundation, I want to express our warm appreciation to Susan Ford Bales, Ann Compton, Bing Goey, Jonathan Pliska, and Nicola Ripley for their insights and stories. Thank you all. I also want to let our viewers know that despite the long COVID winter we've just passed through, the Betty Ford daylilies are all coming up strong and beautiful on the grounds outside the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and Museum. Like the remarkable woman for whom they are named, there is no keeping them down. Those daylilies, they are emblematic of the spirit of today's program. After coming through so many hard months, we wanted a program that affirmed the joys of spring, of new life, perseverance, and hope, all reminiscent of the spirit of Betty Ford herself. Thanks so much to our sponsors of today's beautiful event, in particular the Meyer Foundation, Amway, Fifth Third Bank, Spectrum Health, Blue Cross Blue Shield Blue Care Network of Michigan, and Green with Envy. Also, a special shout out to Chef and his team at the Frederick Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park for our gourmet lunches and much else. Our gratitude to Bob Hooker, J.C. Heisinger, and David Hooker, President and CEO of Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park, for making it possible for students to enjoy today's celebration. And of course, we are always grateful to our friends of Ford for their continued celebration of Betty Ford and their unwavering support for all the activities at the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, especially through the COVID tide. The funds raised from today's event will benefit future civic and educational opportunities at the Foundation and also our DeVos Learning Center. So stay safe and healthy as we look forward to the day when we can all be together again.